Alrighty, so about 2 episodes ago, I dedicated an entire episode to Image Comics, mainly because, well, this is currently going on. Well, this is hopefully going to wrap up the last of the 90s episodes, but I'm not going to promise you anything, considering that something could always creep up, and there's no need to go into the comment section below and tell me that I've wasted probably about 20 to 30 seconds explaining all this to you. Let's get in on this. Alrighty, so to fully understand what happened with comic books in the 90s, we have to understand the Dark Age, Image Comics, the rise of the superstar artist, and the speculator bubble. Since we've already covered Image Comics, this should be relatively short, hopefully. Okay, so the Dark Age. A lot of people like to tag 1985 as the rise of the Dark Age, mainly because of this cover right here for the Crisis on Infinite Earth series, with Superman holding the bloody beaded corpse of his fun-loving and all-around good girl counterpart. But to be quite honest, the Dark Age didn't really come into full effect until 1 year later in 1986 with The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen series. This also allowed other such Dark Age stories to creep up, like X-Men's Dark Phoenix saga and several different others. By the time all this had happened, the speculator bubble was on the rise. So what was the speculator bubble? Well, you see, here's the thing. Whereas fans were buying up new comic books in astounding amounts, they were also buying up old comic books that made them fans to begin with in the first place, with now people telling all new human interest stories of the same damn thing. I bought this comic book as a child for pennies, and I just sold it for thousands. Soon enough, these older comic books started to get extravagant price tags for the right collectors, and gave birth to an all-new type of businessmen called speculators. Well, what were speculators? Speculators were a group of businessmen who sought out buying new comic books that would look like over time they would appreciate in values as the old ones did. But how would they tell the right comic books? Okay, yes, we all know why this was a stupid idea, but let me finish, okay? Well, by paying attention to what kind of old comic books were fetching high prices, debut issues, new characters, deaths of old characters, crazy plot turns. Eventually, companies like Marvel and DC, along with many others, started creating comic books aimed specifically at this trends. And now, the superstar artist. So, what was the superstar artist? Well, not to be rude to anyone here, but before most recently, artists, aside from Stan Lee, had always been more popular than the writers. With all this being said, Marvel and DC sought to keep their artists happy by letting them write issues as well to give them more control. And as covered in a previous episode for Image Comics, majority of these artists went over to working exclusively for Image Comics or working for Image Comics in general, along with many other companies. So, what happened? Well, everything just kind of fell apart, really, but the biggest contributor was the speculator bubble finally bursting. You see, everyone had managed to ignore one simple logical flaw to all of this. Old comic books were worth a lot of money because no one ever thought old comic books would ever be worth a lot of money. Because of this, and because these new books were now being published and sold with that in mind, they weren't going to go up in value anytime soon. So with all this being said and done, everyone had pretty much wasted their time. It's kind of hard to pinpoint right when everything went wrong, considering the fact that it was more or less a slow-motion train wreck than a giant explosion that happened all at once, but a lot of people like to tag 1996 as the year the great comic disaster for what was the sheer baffle of Marvel Comics filing for bankruptcy. But did the 90s really make more bad than good? Well, in my opinion, no, not really. Now, hang on, before all of you get upset, just hear me out. Without the 90s, trade paperbacks wouldn't have been made, and we wouldn't be able to enjoy these older comics without having to pay these extravagant price tags in order to be able to read them. Not only that, but before 1997, there were no trade paperbacks available for buying. All the old stories were in those older comic books, which were, well, extremely hard to come across, especially if you wanted one in good condition, or in readable condition anyways. So with all this being said, yeah, the 90s kind of had to happen, not just because of time, but because, well, they had to happen. And in my personal opinion, I think the 90s helped grow the comic book industry instead of what many people tend to think shortened it. I'm CJ, and I will catch you guys later.